What are ideas that are new or challenge my previous beliefs about the exceptionality? I didn't know very much about learning disabilities before starting this assignment, so I found it really interesting that there was so much research, in particular research towards verbal learning disabilities. It was really new to me that science had identified so many psychological processes that were the cause of these difficulties, and that reading, writing, language, and math disabilities were simply basic symptoms. Basically they were just symptoms of these underlying processes that seen in an academic context. The varying nature of learning disabilities means that a number of psychological processes could be deficient, creating a different barrier to be overcome for each individual. So in essence, two students couldn't really have the same, or they could have the same type of reading disability, but it wasn't necessarily the truth. What I found interesting was that the amount of research dedicated to each of these psychological processes was at the point where they were able to find that the whole idea of phonemic awareness was one of the foundational causes of many students with reading disabilities, and this is actually one of the driving forces for research in this field. The other topic that I found to be very interesting was memory. In particular, it was working memory, which is basically the use of our short-term memory. And the research that's inquiring about multiple types of memory found that students with learning disabilities could increase their memory scores if they were taught a memory strategy. So one of the reasons why I chose to do this assignment on learning disabilities was because it was one of my areas of ignorance. From having completed this research, I've realized that the challenge of teaching the students with learning disabilities could be one of the most gratifying teaching experiences. I really think that for teachers who really want to challenge their ability to facilitate learning, working with students with learning disabilities would be ideal. So it's definitely a barrier to overcome, but it's with the right strategy, I think it's definitely attainable for every student and teacher. And since my next placement will be at Sir Guy Carleton, I'll have a chance to put my newfound knowledge to work. Describe a journal article that addresses a concern or current practice related to exceptionality. Although there were quite a few studies that were referred to in the resources that I read, I decided to find an article that met one of the concerns, which was that I found there was a shortage in the past 20 years in the number of math-related interventions for students with math difficulties. So the article I chose is listed below, and what it was somewhat of a meta-analysis on many different instructional interventions that had to do with algebra. And so what this study did was look at many different interventions and tried to summarize their results. And so one of the things they did find was that students with learning disabilities, whenever they took part in these instructional interventions, the performance of their algebra most likely improved, except it didn't necessarily have an impact on every group. So it most likely works, but I guess the lesson is that we can't generalize that all interventions will work with every student. Another thing they found was that to properly show an improvement in the algebra problem-solving skills, there had to be a comprehensive instructional approach. So basically they couldn't approach the teaching instruction by focusing on small aspects of the problem solving. They had to make sure they looked at the big picture, and this was one way to the way they determined it was necessary to avoid splintering the knowledge that the students had about problem solving. Another thing they found really worked was that the math problems they had were very meaningful problems that were applicable to real life. And this is something that comes into play into the next point, where in all the instructional activities that they had, they found that using things like having a rationale and as well as opportunities for use, as well as modeling, giving the students feedback, all these instructional activities all seem to work, regardless of whether they were using computers, so assistive technology, or if it was a teacher-guided activity. They found that these instructional activities would create an effective instructional design. So there were quite a few books that I used, but there were 4 resources that I found to be the most useful. One of them was the course textbook, which was definitely more geared towards teachers. And even though it wasn't specifically about learning disabilities, there was a good chapter on that, and it gave you a good idea of what to expect within a classroom with students who have learning disabilities. Another resource I used was LDAO, which was a great website, which was specifically geared towards learning disabilities, and I could tell that it was written more for parents of students. So it went into detail into a bit of the information processing, but not into any medical or biological information. And that's what I found really interesting. So I dug a bit deeper, and I found 2 books that gave me exactly that information. One book by William N. Bender, and in this book, it was one of my best resources because of the depth to which it explained many of the underlying causes in the research that's been done on the topics, as well as the research that was lacking. I liked it because it began explaining learning disabilities in a biological and medical context, and then it broke it down into chapters on cognitive, reading, writing, language, and math deficiencies. So I highly recommend this book for those who want a deeper understanding of the disability with teaching strategies and tips that are evidence-based. Another book that I found was very useful was this book by Barry Edwards McNamara. So the book was also referenced many studies which were conducted, and even though it had a bit of medical and biological data, it didn't have as much as the first book. But what I did enjoy was that the first 2 chapters were dedicated to the evolving definition and the history of learning disabilities and how it came to be, because this is something that is still evolving to this day. The book also contains information about learning disabilities at different stages of life. So it was describing learning disabilities from preschool to adult. And then finally, one of the most useful ones was ldonline.org. And it is probably one of the most practical websites because it contains numerous articles concerning all types of learning disabilities. And a lot of these articles are geared towards strategies that you can use in the classroom, and they always reference scientific studies that have been done in the past. How will I incorporate these learnings into teaching practice? So a lot of the information that I learned through this research is directly applicable to teaching, because either we're learning about how to define learning disabilities or diagnose them, or the resources are teaching you or giving you teaching strategies that you can use in the classroom. So there's definitely a lot of teaching strategies that I was able to get out of these books and websites. And so I think that having resources available and knowing where to go to get them was definitely one of the most important things I learned. Of course, if I'm working with students with learning disabilities, I want to find the best teaching strategy that I can use with them. But I think doing so is not as easy as it sounds, which is why I think having really good supportive resources such as websites and books will help to take me further and advance my teaching practice. So I learned quite a bit, and in fact, I've already started to apply some of this knowledge to my teaching practice. I recently began tutoring a student who very likely has a learning disability in math. And while working with her, I realized that part of the difficulty she was having was due to problems with her memory. So to help her get over this hump, I tried to create a reference sheet that she could look at whenever she was working on her math problems, and this was definitely a helpful suggestion for her, and I think she's still using that. I think that many teachers take for granted the fact that students will be able to find their own learning strategy. Sometimes this isn't the case, and it's the teacher's role to not only present the content that they're learning in an enticing fashion, but also to show the students how to retain and encode this information and content so they can use it later on. One of the issues that I came across was the fact that the diagnosed cases of learning disability was expanding due to a difficulty in defining what the term actually means. So I think it's definitely a problem that should eventually be solved, particularly if the research on the link between brain function and learning disabilities continues to advance. Once the science reaches a certain point, I think that it should be possible to define learning disabilities not only through their functioning, but also at a medical level. Another issue that came up was of teacher burnout. Although this is probably referring to the burnout that occurs in the US, I would think that there might be similar issues in Canadian schools. And I think one of the best ways to avoid this type of burnout would be to constantly inform ourselves about the new strategies that are coming out and try to apply them in our classrooms. And I think the most effective teachers do that, and I don't think it transpires often enough. Very often I think once teachers get into the classroom, many of them become too busy to continue and push the limits of their own teaching practice, which is why I think one of the lessons I learned was I should definitely continue to try and learn and improve myself as a teacher and try different strategies, because in the long run it's probably going to benefit both my style as well as the student's education.